Let's see how the console war is going. This
The
amazing
Formula One series
battle.
returns in F1
Incredible.
2022, this year marking several
Incredible.
key changes to the game's visuals
Key
and feature
change.
set on consoles and PC alike. Of course, the series got a true next-gen upgrade with last year's F1 2021. There we were introduced to full native apps on PS5, Xbox Series X and S with ray traced reflections.
Let's see who's got the better features and stuff like that.
FPS modes on the two
Oh,
Ego
120
machines.
FPS
It was
as
a great
well.
first step for the Ego engine,
This is
but
crazy.
dipping of the toe on new systems, only slightly let down by the lack of 120 FPS on Series S. But today, well, F1 2022 keeps
Max
all of that,
Verstappen,
but
Lewis
has the
Hamilton,
chance
the
to go one
battle.
further.
No,
So
this
exactly
year
how do the
I
visuals
think it's
compare
more
between
Leclerc
this and last year's
Verstappen.
game? How do the consoles stack up to one another, and in particular
The graphic
PC with
is-
fully maxed out settings? And is 120 FPS
The graphic
actually a lot on PS5 and Series X?
It's
Let's find
cool
out.
anyway, but on the console. Ray tracing, all this stuff. It's crazy, it's crazy. It's an insane experience.
Now, up front, I will say many of the technical underpinnings of F1 2021, on console at least, stay similar in 2022. Here's a comparison on PS5 between this and last year's game, and honestly,
It's
the
the same,
bulk of
basically.
what we're getting in actual gameplay is near identical. We get a native 4K picture on PS5 once again, an example here on both sides. DRS is enabled to allow drops in pixel counts, but overwhelmingly this
Dynamic
is a 4K
ray
presentation once
shading.
again,
I don't remember
with
what
a
is
perfect
DRS
60
means.
FPS in play. Visually speaking, we do see some extra details added to the tracks here and there. Subtle things like additional bloom around the lights on the Abu Dhabi stage here, and likewise more decorative touches to the center of the track. The overall track design is revamped too, and so you'll see that our route
Yeah, how can
eventually
you improve
diverges at a
something that
select
looks
point,
good?
meaning our
It looks
comparison
really good
no
at the
longer
moment,
syncs up.
so
The same goes for circuits in Spain and Australia, with both receiving a similar revamp in layout, if not a radical one on the
a really
technical
beautiful
front.
game. I don't know when was the last time I played a Formula 1 game.
In direct comparison, the result is more or less as you'd expect, with resolution being the main dividing point. It's a native 4K on PS5 and Series X, and 1080p on Series S, all making use of DRS. But there are some odd differences between them, say if we compare PS5 to Series X. Now, as before, ray traced reflections and shadows only engage outside of gameplay. In pre-race moments, replays, and
so
the main menu,
during the
it's why
gameplay you
these
don't
points
have ray
all
tracing.
render at 30 FPS, while the actual racing targets 60 FPS once ray tracing is disabled. Both PS5 and Series X are matched in their setups in this regard, and likewise this goes for Series S too. Except there's a curious difference. On Series X, for example, the reflection of the steering wheel in the center on the right side of the cockpit stays fully rendered regardless of where we look. It's a true sign
Okay,
of
this
ray
is
tracing
nice
in
and all
effect,
like it.
and
So
looks
some
pretty
deal
great.
breaking
But on PS5,
stuff.
it's a different story. The reflection of the steering wheel appears at first, but then disappears and rematerializes based on screen space information. In other words, a classic sign of SSR. 1 minute it's reflected across the side of our cockpit on PS5, but once it's out of view of the player, it fades away.
Okay, yeah, but if he's out of view
On
of the
the
player,
surface, then, it appears PS5
do you really
relies
care?
on the SSR method for reflections in this moment at least, while Series X uses proper ray tracing for the cockpit. It's also curious to note that even Series S uses the same RT technique as
Oh
Series
my
X.
god, the
So
Series
then,
S
you'd
has got a
assume
better
it's
ray
fault
tracing than
just
a
on
PS5. It's crazy.
And yet,
What
there's
can you do?
another
What
twist
can you
here.
do, PS people?
If we
What
switch
can you
over
do?
to PC with all
Sometimes
settings
it's like that.
completely maxed out, including ray trace reflections, our PC shows the same SSR-like technique as a PS5. It's all very curious.
Okay, so it's
and
more
there's
like a
slight
bug.
chance this is a bug for select platforms. Either way,
Okay,
the end result
yeah.
on Series X and S right now is much closer to what we'd expect of a true ray trace technique, with none of the artifacts we would
and
expect of SSR.
Xbox is
That
on the
said, the
top.
Ego engine is obviously a complex beast. Clearly, it relies on multiple techniques to
I know
achieve
this
reflections
game
for
makes me
PC
feel
and
like
console
buying
alike.
a steering
So,
wheel
in
and
replays, for example,
Formula
you'll
1
notice
game.
our PC with max settings still uses SSR mixed in with proper ray tracing, and even elements of cube mapping. Looking into puddles, for example, Different elements fade in and out depending on the camera angle. The cars, trackside details, and roadside barriers each use a different approach. Some depend on screen space information, SSR, while others fall into the ray tracing BVH. In practice then, ray tracing works in much the same way between PS5, Series X and S, with the exception seemingly being inside these cockpits. As for the other
Okay, so
settings,
it's the same
well, the
basically.
differences
So
are few and far between. PS5 appears
yeah,
to
but
have
still Xbox
an
people,
unusual glitch on
Xbox
reflections. I will say
fan
again,
are
it looks
going
like
to
a
say
bug.
that
This adds an
Xbox
odd
on top or
multicolored
stuff like that.
artifact under cars in pre-race scenes.
I have a
but
Series
that's
X, but
really
I
the
don't care
extent
at
of the
all.
differences next to Series X, and most other settings look identical. Looking to Series S, meanwhile, it's remarkable how close it is in overall settings to a Series X. I mean, first of all, we have to accept
It looks the
it's running
same, but
at
it's
a
not
quarter of the
4K.
resolution at a native 1080p. It's still pushing a very similar end result in cutscenes and gameplay in terms of the rest of the effects and settings. The only real visible drawback on Series S is that ray trace reflections are rendered at a lower resolution over the cockpit. Looking to the side before the race, it's a more pixelated appearance, but you'd have to look hard and close to spot it.
Yeah, it looks good for the price. How
One
much is
final point
that?
relates to a new
£250,
subtle feature for F1 2022,
$250.
ray-traced transparencies. On PC, it adds to an already huge suite of options, where switching RT transparencies on means we get reflections on, well, transparent materials like glass. Actually, this is shown off nicely in the main menus, with car window panes mirroring lights above. The good news, comparing PC maxed out directly to a console, like Series X here, RT transparencies are seemingly included on console this year. In this case, my Titan RTX couldn't quite hit max settings at 4K, and so I've engaged Nvidia'S Dlss setting to enable a stable frame rate, which is why image quality may differ to a native 4K on the right. Again though, RT transparencies are a subtle enhancement and mostly invisible during a race. Even in this PC footage where ray tracing is possible during gameplay, it's an expensive and rarely cited extra. Still, it's a nice addition to the Ego engine.
So on the console, during the gameplay, you don't have ray tracing.
On the surface then, there are
But you've
gains
got
on console,
120
if
FPS,
small.
so
Perhaps the bigger additions overall this year are on PC, with ray trace transparencies among them. The other major upgrade is VR support though. F1 2022
Ooh,
is now
VR,
compatible
virtual
with a range of
reality.
VR headsets on PC, nicely suiting the cockpit view. This is a PC exclusive feature for now, and alas, the team at Codemasters have already stated that they have no plans at this time to bring it to PSVR on PS5, though perhaps in the future it'll find its way over. Also new to PC is support for Nvidia'S Dlss scaling technology, as mentioned, and there's plans to add in AMD's equivalent FSR 2.0 down the road, but for now, VR headset support, DLSS, and extra ray tracing features show PC is in a pretty great place. And honestly, for anyone wanting to use the game's top settings, like all the ray tracing toggles, having DLSS support now makes a big difference in keeping performance in check.
George Russell.
Last
He
up
retired
is the
in
topic of
Silverstone on the last
performance.
race.
To cut to the chase, both PS5 and Series X are perfectly handled. The idea to chop out ray tracing during gameplay on the surface feels like a bit of a compromise, but makes a huge amount of sense to prioritize 60 FPS. I mean, even on a Titan RTX, I really struggled to hit 4K resolution at 60 FPS with all visual settings at max.
What the
Actually,
fuck? Really?
even
A
with
Titan
DLSS
RTX is
quality
better
mode,
than a
I
3090.
ended
I
up
don't
settling
know. I
for a
don't know.
30 FPS cap during
I think
gameplay,
so.
since if I let it run unlocked, it'd circulate around the 45 FPS region. All things considered then, it's a hugely demanding game on PC. And so the fact we're still getting a taste of ray tracing tech in select points on console is something of a win, I think. During gameplay itself, we do lose it, but what's most important there is the 60 FPS target on PS5 and Series X, which is perfectly locked down. This even applies during peak stress points, heavy rain, the maximum car count, and driving on a complex track like Monaco doesn't move the needle under 60. So, as far as the Ego engine is
The
concerned, this
new
is
next
the
gen
right call, I
console
think.
are
The right trade-off on
so
console
much money for the
playability.
value.
And even Series
It's
S holds
amazing
up with a solid 60 FPS.
to live in an experience like this.
A final word on the 120Hz mode, also known as the performance mode. This one's just for PS5 and Series X, and this time I did notice a discrepancy here which slightly favors PS5. In running
Ooh.
the same stress points on Monaco, maximum cars, wet weather, there's barely a blip on PS5's reading. It's a rock solid 120 FPS, typically V-synced. However, it does appear Series X has more issues in keeping V-sync. While still holding to 120 FPS near constantly, there's regular signs of screen tearing on the latest build on Series X. I'll slow this down just to highlight it a bit better, but honestly I'd be very hard pressed to catch it in full motion, at 120 FPS anyway. The
So
refresh
it's okay.
is too fast and the artifact is too subtle. It's more of a nitpick really, and the frame rate is practically locked at 120 FPS. And on a VRR display especially, it'll be even trickier to catch by eye on Series X.
Oh, the game looks really good.
On balance then, F1 2022 feels more like an incremental step after last year's blowout of next-gen features like ray tracing and 120Hz. This time we get a suite of optimizations and fixes, while this year a lot of work appears to have also gone into the VR support on PC, the Dlss, and of course, extras like ray trace transparencies are a neat bonus all round. On the plus side, as one of the most demanding games on PC, it's impressive how fluidly PS5, Series X, and S run it at 60 FPS. The only sore point is that F1 2022 is missing the Breaking Point campaign from last year, a story mode charting a young F1's driver's rise via CG cutscenes. There was potential in the idea. It gave the series quite literal character, and it feels like it's been thrown away. In its place, we get the F1 Life mode instead, an exhibition space for your cars, but hopefully we'll see some form of story mode return to the series. But that's
I
all
don't
I've
know.
got on
I'm not
F1
sure about that.
2022 today. Just
I
a
don't
quick
really
one,
care.
honestly,
If I
since it does
played the
feel like a
game, I
more
wouldn't care about
slight
story
upgrade
mode.
compared to
But
last
maybe
year's.
people
Still,
care.
if you did
Who
find it
knows?
useful or insightful in any way,
But
feel
yeah,
free
but
to
the
like
game
or
is looking
subscribe,
good.
and
Look
don't
at this
forget to hit
graphic,
that
is
bell for
insane.
instant notifications as
Really
any new
clean
video lands.
4K.
To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.
A beautiful game for beautiful people. Make sure to buy Formula 1 if you have the money. If you don't, wait when it's second hand or discounted. Or I don't know if it's in the Game Pass for Xbox, but I don't think so. Anyway, this was the reaction to Formula 1 Digital Foundry Tech Review. PS5 versus PC versus Xbox Series S / Xbox Series X. I hope you enjoyed this in detail reaction full of emotions. Probably you left the video already, so if you didn't, comment potato. Peace.